Hi, and welcome to Psychology. We're looking at the chapter on learning. Now, if you ask anyone who, the question, ask anybody this question, how do you learn to do that? What would they likely say? Well, I practiced it, or I observed somebody else doing it, or being told how to do it. Wondering about one's own and others' behavior is one of the main topics of humans are interested in, and we want to know why did you behave like you did, or what makes someone behave differently from me, or how can I learn to behave like that? Well, when my daughter was 3-4 years old, she learned how to scramble and cook an egg in the microwave by watching me, is what I assumed. She served me a scrambled egg and shell one morning in bed, and she had never been practiced cooking, as far as I'm aware, that way. I don't think we had her do that. And she was never told how to cook an egg, but it appears as if she observed me doing it sufficiently to learn basically the behavior. We may need some practice to refine the skill that we acquire, as in my case, my daughter, who didn't remove the eggshell when scrambling an egg for me. There is no doubt that watching and observing others engage and perform different behaviors significantly can influence our own behavior. Now, furthermore, understanding the key principles of why and how we learn can provide insightful recognition of the behaviors of others and ourselves. So, by definition, learning is defined as relatively permanent change in behavior, knowledge, capability, attitudes acquired through experience. All right? So learning can't, now it's important here because this is where it gets to say, well, it can't. Learning cannot be attributed to illness, injury, or maturation. So with maturation, if it's just a normal part of growing up, a baby walking, that has to do with maturation, not about learning. For example, infants do not learn how to walk. Instead, basic motor skills and maturation govern every species. Learning is an important topic in psychology and has had a long history of researching how we learn. Now, we're going to begin our review with one of the more simple and powerful terms and powerful forms of learning that we know of so far, and that is classical conditioning. And it's a form of learning in which an association is formed between a stimulus and another stimulus, creating a learned response through these associations. So that's the good and the bad of what we like, desire, value, and other choices that we tend to make are a result of learning. A stimulus is any event or object in the environment that we directly or indirectly interact with. Now, you might remember Pavlov's experiment. Pavlov was a Russian biologist and was doing some experiments with dogs. And Pavlov's experiments demonstrated some of the basic principles of classical conditioning. During classical conditioning, a neutral stimuli, in Pavlov's case it was the tone or the bell, is presented shortly before an unconditioned stimuli, well, that's the food, which naturally elicits or brings forth an unconditioned response, salivation in this case. So the unconditioned stimuli, or the unconditioned stimuli, the food, normally brings about the salivation. And he's trying to match or associate the tone and the food. So that if he can associate those, then maybe he can remove the food, and the dogs, when they hear the tone, will get the same response as if they got it with the food. And that was his experiment, essentially. So after repeated pairings, food and the tone, the conditioned stimulus, the tone, by itself could elicit the conditioned response, the salivation. So the unconditioned stimulus, also known as the US, is the stimulus that is naturally occurring and produces the reflex, in this case, or involuntary conditioned response. Both are called unconditioned because they are not learned. For example, food, loud noises, light in your eye, puff of air in your eye, they're all unconditioned stimulus, and salivation, startle, response, or contracting of your pupils to the light, or blinking in response to this unconditioned stimulus is what's known as the unconditioned response. You didn't learn to blink your eye. Your eye blinks because it's an instinctual, almost automatic response to air being blown into it. The conditioned stimulus, the CS, begins as a neutral stimuli. So it has no association with it. It has no immediate feedback that happens as it's shown. But when paired with an unconditioned stimulus, eventually begins to elicit the reflex on its own. The reflex response to the conditioned stimulus is called the conditioned response, or CR. And both stimulus and response are learned. Some terms that we'll need to be familiar with when we talk about classical conditioning. And we'll start with, and we'll see this also when it comes to operant conditioning, extinction. Now, extinction is the lessening of the conditioned response in the absence of the unconditioned stimuli. Over time, Pavlov found that the salivation to the tone without the food became weaker and weaker and finally disappeared. However, what is known as spontaneous recovery, that's when the conditioned response can occur again after a time delay without further conditioning. Extinction is not permanent. The conditioned response can be reactivated. Essentially, this is us where we are adaptable to change. Even though we don't need it right now, we can draw on it later. That's previous learning. Another term, generalization. Here, other stimuli, similar to the original, produce or elicit the response similar to the conditioned response. So Pavlov found that a different but similar tone could produce the salivating. That's generalization. If I learn to dress in my bedroom as a child, and then I go into another house, not my bedroom, but I find that I can dress successfully there, I've generalized the dressing skill, if you will, from my bedroom to any other room that I might choose to get changed in. Now, this is one that we often misunderstand because there's more than one definition for this in our life, if you will, and that is discrimination. Discrimination here in learning is used differently. Now listen to the definition. Learning to respond to some things and not others. That's discrimination. This is how we respond to multiple choice questions. You're given a question, you have four multiple choice answers. You have to discriminate of the four which is the most correct. And that's discrimination. So it's not as you would use it, say, in stereotyping or in sociology. John Watson, he initiated an experiment to prove fear could be classically conditioned, and this was in 1919, and as you remember, I posted a video called Little Albert. And it was Little Albert was conditioned to fear not only a white rat, but generalized to include other fuzzy animals like a rabbit or cat, and conditioned to be afraid of white rats and other white objects. So the fear response, or fear responses, you can look at where some of our associations have been made for ourselves. Going to a dental visit, that the smell of the office, the sound of the drill, the sight of the chair can produce. That's the unconditioned stimuli along with the conditioned stimuli produces a conditioned response. Okay, drug use. The conditioned stimuli is associated with drug use, leads individuals back out to seek those substances. In advertising, a neutral product is associated with people, objects, or situations that consumers will like, eliciting a positive response. So if I like Brad Pitt and he's wearing that watch, I might associate that watch is good. I like that watch because I like Brad Pitt. And as much as you might go, don't be so naive. You don't have to buy something because you got a person that you like. You might be surprised how much that association influences some of your choices and purchases. They wouldn't keep doing it if it didn't work. And that's the thing to pay attention to. So let's look at 4 factors that can influence classical conditioning. One, the number of pairings of conditioned stimuli and unconditioned stimuli. Now, the greater the number of pairings, the stronger the conditioned response. And that just makes sense. That's practice. That's like doing things over and over again. The more you practice it, the better it gets. Intensity, number 2. The intensity of the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned response is stronger if the conditioned stimulus is paired with a strong unconditioned stimuli. And so that's really important. That intensity of the relationship in the association is important. 3, how reliably the conditioned stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus must reliably predict the occurrence of the unconditioned stimulus in order for the conditioned response to happen. So the better we can, for example, the reliability is if everything that I was doing I needed to do in the same way. So if every stimulation is the same, if you're doing your laundry, the washing machine gives you a bing when it's done that you can make that transfer. So there's the association that's reliable. It's always going to do it. I'll always be there. I'll always make the transition, and it will always ding, and I will. So that's reliable. 4, the temporal relationship between conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Conditioning takes place fastest if the conditioned stimulus occurs shortly before the unconditioned stimulus. But conditioning will not occur if the two stimuli occur at the same time or if the unconditioned stimulus occurs first. What's important here is immediacy. And that we'll revisit, will come back as another place where immediacy is important. Now, the next sort of area of learning that had a huge impact on the way we understand learning came on what's known as operant conditioning, and it was introduced by B.F. Skinner, is a type of learning in which the consequences of behavior are manipulated in order to either increase or decrease the frequency of a response or shape an entirely new response. Those terms we'll get into, because important here is reinforcers. And also important here is the concept of shaping. So a reinforcer is a consequence that follows a response and strengthens it. So this is what's really important in terms of behavior management that I've done with families, is if whatever you're doing isn't working, but is the child's behavior is still going up, it means that whatever you're doing is reinforcing the behavior. Now, sometimes we just have to be more conscious about what is it that's being reinforced. Like, how am I reinforcing? Sometimes it's because you're present with that child. That's the only reason why they're misbehaving, is because you're there with them. You're reinforcing. So 1, it follows the response and strengthens it, and 2, increases the probability that it's going to reoccur. So that's important. Those are the 2 conditions of reinforcers. So, some operant conditioning, operant techniques, they include shaping, and I mentioned that earlier. Shaping consists of the gradual molding of a desired behavior or a response by reinforcing any movement in the direction of the desired response. Shaping might be if I want my child to be friendly with my other child, that I will reinforce every time my eldest child sees the youngest child, that every time they engage with them positively, I'll reinforce it. So I can slowly but surely increase the pro-social behavior with the younger child by shaping their behavior, by positively reinforcing all small movements in the direction that I want to see, more social engagement with the younger child. Gradually, responses are guided toward the ultimate goal. Now, with the use of successive approximations, a series of gradual steps, each one is more similar to the final desired response. Parents shape children by praising them each time they show improvement. Circus animals have learned different feats through shaping. Pigeons learn how to bowl and play piano through shaping. Those were done in Skinner's Skinner box. Now, extinction, another term, This is the weakening and disappearance of a conditioned response as a result of withholding reinforcements. If I've always, and I use the example of every time I'm present, my child's behavior goes up. If I want to extinguish, so that's the weakening or disappearance of a conditioned response as a result of withholding reinforcement, I have to walk away when my child is misbehaving so they don't inadvertently get reinforced with my presence, and that my presence can be associated with desirable behavior. Generalization. Now we use this with classical. There's an application with operant. The tendency to make the learned response to a stimulus similar to that for which the response was originally reinforced. Same thing. The pigeon trained to peck a yellow disc will pick a similarly colored disc. That's generalizing to other colors similar to the original one. The less similar the color, the lower the rates of pecking will be. And then discriminative stimulus. A stimulus that signals whether a certain response or behavior is likely to be rewarded, ignored, or punished. Children misbehave with a grandparent because the discriminative stimulus, the parents, are not present. The children are quite familiar with behaving correctly when the parents are there, but when the parents aren't there, maybe they don't. So now we'll look at reinforcement, positive and negative, as well as primary and secondary reinforcers and reinforcement schedules. Okay, when we look at positive reinforcement, any pleasant or desirable consequence that follows a response increases the probability that the response will be repeated. Those are the conditions. There are roughly the same as rewards, that is positive reinforcement. If you smile when you walk down the street and you see people and you smile and some people smile back, you say nice things. You want to smile at everyone as you rewarded reinforcement, and therefore increase the likelihood that you'll do it again. So it's a neat experiment to see, one, how many people you will affect, and one, how often you get reinforced for your behavior. Now this is one that's tricky because it gets misunderstood. Negative reinforcement is not punishment. This is often misunderstood as it does not mean how many of us will use it. Negative reinforcement means the termination of an unpleasant condition after a response. It increases the probability that the response will be repeated. Now, for example, if the air conditioning is on and it's disturbing you, if you turn off the air conditioning, that's negative reinforcement. You've gone to bed, you're settled in, and you can hear the dripping of the sink. You get up and you turn the faucet tighter, and it stops the dripping. Negative reinforcement. A heroin addict will do almost anything to get another fix and avoid the pains of withdrawal. Negative reinforcement. So we'll look at, when we talk about reinforcement, there's two types. There's primary and secondary. Primary reinforcers are reinforcers that fulfill the basic physical need for survival and does not depend on learning. So you got food, water, sleep as examples, whereas secondary reinforcers are acquired or learned through association with other reinforcers. I didn't grow up not learning the association between, or the secondary reinforcer of doing work and earning money, but I did learn that. So that's an acquired or learned. It's not built in. So secondary reinforcers, money, praise, applause, anything that is not built for just basic survival. If we had to acquire and learn it, then that's a secondary reinforcer. Now, we're going to move to schedules. Schedules of reinforcement determine which responses will be reinforced. And this is important because once you get in past the primary and secondary and we get into schedules, this is where we start to put pen to paper on collecting data and measuring and planning behavioral steps, if you will. This is all about if you're teaching, or you're doing behavior management, or you're working in a daycare, knowing how to do schedules of reinforcement and plan and organize that in a meaningful and desirable way that gets a child's behavior from here at its infancy stage where it doesn't know to a point where it's competent. So there's a tip here, and it'll make sense when we go through these. Anytime you hear ratio as a part of a schedule, that means numbers. So you keep ratio and numbers grouped, intervals and time. So there will be schedules that are based on ratios, so that's considered numbers we're going to be using, or there will be schedules based on intervals, and that will be about time. There's also a couple of others. One is continuous, which means you reinforce every response. That's continuous. And partial, this occurs when correct responses are reinforced randomly or intermittently. And again, these will make more sense as we go through. So the first schedule of reinforcement, fixed ratio. So ratio, we're talking about numbers. So fixed ratio is reinforcing after a set number of responses. So if I'm doing behavior, I'm teaching a skill set to a child and I set up a fixed ratio of 5, it just means every time I see a correct behavior, I'm going to reinforce it every 5 times I see that behavior. So it's fixed. 5 times I see it, I reinforce it. After 5 more times, I reinforce. After 5 more times, I reinforce. Or 3, or 2, or every time, but it's fixed. The variable ratio is reinforcement given after a varying number of correct response. So in contrast to fixed every 5 times, variable will be after the first 2, I'll reinforce. Next time, 3, and I'll reinforce. Then 6, and I'll reinforce. Then 2, and I'll reinforce. So it's variable. Then we get to fixed interval. Interval means time. So reinforce the appropriate response after a fixed amount of time has elapsed. So I might say, I will reinforce in a fixed interval. So reinforce the first appropriate response within a fixed amount of time. Let's say I do my intervals at 5 minutes. The first time in that first 5 minutes I see the desirable behavior and I reinforce it, that's it for that 5-minute period. If I see that behavior again, I don't reinforce it. But I do after that first interval, fixed interval of 5 minutes, then I do it again. So I have discrete 5-minute intervals where I reinforce the first appropriate response, but only once and only at the first one. The variable interval, again, we're talking about time. Reinforce the first appropriate response after a variable amount of time. So I have a 5-minute chunk, then a 2-minute, then a 6-minute, then a 3-minute, then a 2-minute, and I do the same thing. I find the first example of that behavior within that time period, I reinforce it. I wait to the next period, whatever the length of time is, it's variable, and I do the first one. Those are your schedules. Now, punishment, I need to touch on this because it gets misunderstood. Now, punishment generally suppresses rather than extinguishes behavior. It does not help people develop more appropriate behaviors. Just because you punish them, they don't automatically emerge with the correct answer or the correct behavior. And it can cause fear, anger, and hostility and aggression in the punished person. The person who uses aggressive punishments, such as spanking, can act as a model for aggressive behavior. Now, this will increase aggressive behavior in the one being punished and undesirable responses. Children of abusive or punishing parents are at greater risk than other children to become aggressive and abusive themselves. If you're going to do punishment, there are strategies to use it to be more effective. Now, it's important that if this is what you're choosing, that you've used a variety of other more positive options, and that this is only used in those rare circumstances. The most effective when it's applied at the time or immediately after the problem behavior. In my day, it was very common to hear the expression, "wait till your dad gets home." That was too late. Punishment coming at the end of the day when something happened in the morning, that is not an effective use. If I have misbehaved and there's a punishment, it needs to happen immediately. If it can't happen immediately, I oughtn't do it. It needs to be least punitive to affect change. So that's an important part too. Just because I can spank a small child doesn't mean I ought to. If there's a least punitive way to do it that works, do it. Applied consistently. You can't keep changing it up. It must be something that you're willing and able to do every time. And fourth, and this is important, anger oughtn't be involved. If you're acting in anger, that's the time to step away, calm down, then deal with things. Some other additional learning terms. Escape learning. This is performing a behavior because it prevents or terminates an adversive event. You get a headache and you take an aspirin. Escape learning. You learn how to avoid the adversive event, the headache. And so that's the behavior. The avoidance learning, engaging in behaviors to avoid an aversive consequence. Coming to the dinner table when when mom calls you for dinner and on the 5th time you have arrived, you might say, well, how come it took me 5 times of saying come for dinner and you finally came here? It's because your pitch in your voice and the vein in your neck came out of your head, and I knew then that's when you meant it. That's avoidance learning, to avoid the worst case scenario. Now, another learning is known as learned helplessness. And this has a lot of dynamics as it relates to abnormal psychology as well as psychology. Learned helplessness is a passive resignation to adverse conditions learned through repeated exposure to inescapable and unavoidable aversive elements. Humans who suffer painful experiences they could not avoid or couldn't escape may simply give up and react to disappointment in life by becoming inactive, withdrawn, and depressed. Another application of this, when I was in university, we did an experiment on learned helplessness. Could we teach people to be helpless? And we would give them an activity that they should be able to do well. It was just a physical activity of bumping some buttons to align some lights. And we could control your success rate. And we would put out on the table, beside your workstation where you were asked to perform this task, the results of other people that showed that they were really good, but you weren't successful. And then you would be asked to do a children's puzzle placed upside down so you couldn't see the pictures. And we found that those that had managed to do really well and we let them be successful, they did the puzzle really well within the time, inside the time that we allowed. These were 24-piece puzzles. We gave them 10 minutes to complete them. Those that we had shown how well everybody did, but they couldn't do that well, and they did this over several attempts, when they were given the puzzle to do, they weren't able to complete it within that 10-minute period. They had developed in a relatively short period of time, learned helplessness. Behavior modification. Again, this might be a term you're familiar with, but it often goes badly when delivered because we don't do it correctly. Behavior modification involves systematic application of learning principles to individuals or groups in order to eliminate undesired behavior and encourage desirable behavior. And the one that's most frequently used is token economy systems. Here, in token economy, is a behavior modification program that motivates socially desired behavior by reinforcing it with tokens. Tokens that can be exchanged for desired behaviors or privileges. So you might have, every time you did this pro-social behavior, you got a token that when you collected 20 tokens, you could cash them in for other items, and those would be your rewards. Poker chips or coupons, known as tokens, are given when the patient grooms correctly or does chores or interacts in a socially appropriate way, and positive behavior may stop when the tokens are not given. I won't go through all the stages. It's not important in terms of our chapter here, but I will go in through the next component here, which is timing out. Misbehaving child is removed for a short period of time from sources of positive reinforcement in an attempt to extinguish the unwanted behavior. It's really important that when we apply these techniques, that they're used correctly and applied in the most effective manner. Learning by observing the behavior of others and the consequences of that behavior often involves imitation, and Bandura's famous Bobo doll experiment demonstrated that young children will initiate the aggressive actions of a model even when there's no reinforcement for doing so. Now, some key ingredients he mentioned. Modeling was another name for observational learning, and it can be improved when you follow these basic steps. One was several sessions of the observation preceded attempts to perform the behavior. That in order for us to be successful with observational learning, I needed to see a model do this several times before trying it myself. And then, secondly, another important part to improve learning was repeated in the early stages of practice of the behavior. So it needed to be done several times after I started practicing. I needed to do more to really solidify what it was that I learned. Now, the model, that's a person who demonstrates the behavior or whose behavior is imitated. Now, there were 4 elements to this, and it was really an important part of effective observational learning that, needed to happen for observational learning to occur. One was the learner needed to have attention. They must first pay attention to the model. They must have a capable memory in order to maintain what was done and retain it so they can repeat it themselves. Imitation. The learner must be able to imitate the actions of the model, so they needed to have the capability of doing what it was the model was performing. And then fourthly was motivation. The learner must have the desire to perform the action in order to be successful. Now, that's a really quick overview on learning. It's an important topic. It's involved in our everyday life all the time. But I did a quick overview, and I hope that's helpful for you. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you in the next week's video. Bye now.